in the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge, Alabama. A simple act of changing a Wi-Fi password turns into a shocking confrontation. Marcus Grant, a black man just minding his business, finds himself under suspicion when a nosy neighbor calls 911, accusing him of criminal activity. But what happens when the police dig deeper? Will Marcus's life be forever changed by a mistaken assumption, or will the truth come to light? Join us at Voices of the Underdog as we uncover the twists and turns of this gripping tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. What happens when racial profiling goes too far? Will the community change after this shocking revelation? Oak Ridge, Alabama, a peaceful and quiet suburb where everyone knew everyone, or at least that was how it seemed. A small town nestled away from the bustling cities, Oak Ridge prided itself on its slow pace and tightly knit community. The houses, with their well-kept lawns and cozy porches, sat like little islands in a sea of greenery. It was the kind of place where a neighbor's comings and goings were noticed, whether for good or for ill. Marcus Grant, a 36-year-old freelance graphic designer, had called Oak Ridge home for the past 3 years. He wasn't one to make a lot of noise or seek attention. His work, which he did from the quiet sanctuary of his home office, kept him busy enough. He enjoyed the peace, the isolation, and the stability of a neighborhood where nothing ever really changed. That is, until the day he noticed his Wi-Fi speed was slowing down. At first, it was a minor inconvenience, something that might have been overlooked on any other day. Marcus was sitting at his desk, the soft hum of his computer filling the room as he designed a logo for a small business. The lines on the screen curved and shifted, colors bled into one another, and the creative process took over his mind. But then, just as he was about to finish a particularly intricate design, his internet cut out. The screen froze. Frustrated, Marcus clicked around, trying to reload the page. He noticed that the Wi-Fi indicator on his computer showed a full signal, yet there was a significant lag. The cursor lagged as he moved it across the screen, and the web page barely loaded. Something wasn't right. He picked up his phone and opened the router's settings app. As he scanned the list of devices connected to his Wi-Fi network, his eyes narrowed. There were several unfamiliar names listed under the Connected Devices section. Marcus' brow furrowed. No one should have been using his network without permission. He was certain that when he set up the router, the Wi-Fi password was secure. How had someone gotten access? Feeling a growing unease, Marcus decided to take a closer look. He walked into the living room, through the hallway, and down to the front door. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his feet as he grabbed his shoes. Outside, the midday sun cast long shadows across the front yard. It was a perfect spring day, the kind that made the neighborhood look even more idyllic than usual. As he stood on his front porch, looking out over the quiet street, Marcus realized he had to act quickly. He turned back to his router, sitting on a small table by the window. Reaching down, he unplugged it, then grabbed his phone to change the password. As the router rebooted, Marcus couldn't help but feel a small pang of frustration. It wasn't that he minded a challenge now and then, but this was an intrusion. He liked his privacy, his quiet, and whoever was using his Wi-Fi had overstepped. In the house across the street, Victoria Webb, a new neighbor, watched the scene unfold from her living room window. Victoria, in her mid-50s, had moved into Oak Ridge only a few weeks ago, and so far, she had taken quite a liking to her new home, though she'd yet to fully warm up to her neighbors. She was a curious woman by nature, always eager to know what was going on around her. It wasn't that she intended to cause trouble. No, not at all. But she found herself very intrigued by the comings and goings of those who lived near her. Victoria had observed Marcus before. She had seen him walking in and out of his house a few times, but never took the opportunity to introduce herself. He kept to himself, which made her all the more curious. It wasn't long before she noticed the strange behavior when he walked outside to his porch. Her eyes narrowed as she saw him crouching near the router and fiddling with it, his hands moving quickly over the device, his back slightly hunched. Victoria's instincts kicked in. She had heard of people tampering with things. Was he perhaps doing something shady with his internet? Was he involved in some criminal activity? Marcus didn't exactly give off a suspicious vibe, but the idea that someone might be doing something unlawful in their otherwise peaceful neighborhood did not sit well with her. Without thinking twice, Victoria grabbed her phone, dialed 911 and pressed the speakerphone button. As soon as the operator answered, she spoke in a low but urgent tone. "There's a man across the street, tampering with his router. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but it looks suspicious," Victoria said, glancing nervously out the window as she watched Marcus continue to mess with his equipment. "It's like he's trying to hide something. You should send someone over to check it out." The operator, a calm voice on the other end of the line, asked a few follow-up questions, trying to determine if there was an immediate danger. But in Victoria's mind, the situation felt like a matter of urgency. A man working on his Wi-Fi was an unusual sight, and in her book, that warranted a closer look. After all, there had been rumors about shady activities around the neighborhood, though nothing concrete. Maybe she was just being cautious, but she didn't want to take any chances. As the conversation with the operator came to an end, Victoria sat back down in her armchair. She glanced at the clock. The minutes felt longer as she waited. In the meantime, Marcus was oblivious to the fact that his simple action of resetting his router had raised suspicions in his new neighbor. He was too focused on making sure his connection was secure, taking every precaution to lock down his network from the unknown user who had been draining his bandwidth. The sudden interruption would come soon enough. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. But before Marcus could finish configuring his new password, a voice from the street interrupted the tranquility. "Hey you, what are you doing with that router?" A deep voice called out. Marcus turned to see two officers approaching, their hands resting on the holsters of their weapons. The sight of the police, unprompted, caught him off guard. His heart skipped a beat. What was going on? He had done nothing wrong, so why were they here? "Is everything okay?" he called out, his voice tentative but calm. The officers exchanged a look before one of them spoke. "Someone reported that you were tampering with your internet, possibly involved in some kind of illegal activity." Marcus' eyes widened in disbelief. Tampering with his internet. For a second, he thought he might be dreaming. How could something so simple, so mundane, lead to such a misunderstanding? And just like that, the peace of Oak Ridge had been shattered. The quiet neighbor's routine was about to be turned upside down by a single, hasty decision made by the woman across the street. The wail of sirens sliced through the calm of Oak Ridge, growing louder and closer with every passing second. Marcus Grant stood on his porch, still holding the router in one hand, his phone in the other. He had only just reset the device and was still in the process of securing his Wi-Fi network when the sound of approaching police cars caused his heart to race. This wasn't supposed to happen. What could have possibly gone wrong? It was just a simple task, no different than any other technical adjustment he'd made 1,000 times before. Marcus took a deep breath and walked toward the steps of his porch, setting the router down on the small table next to his front door. He straightened his shirt, trying to keep his composure as the two police officers pulled up and parked in front of his house. They exited their squad car with an air of authority, their uniforms crisp and their body language exuding a sense of readiness. The officers were quick to approach, both looking directly at Marcus as they walked up to his porch. "Hey, you!" one of the officers called out, his voice commanding yet not aggressive. "What's going on here?" Marcus froze for a moment before he answered, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'm just changing my Wi-Fi password," he said, hoping that the simple explanation would suffice. "I noticed some unfamiliar devices connected to my network, so I'm securing it." The officer, a tall man in his late 30s named Officer Jason Rivera, glanced at his partner, Detective Monica Hayes, before responding. She was a seasoned investigator, her sharp features betraying a keen awareness of the world around her. She watched Marcus carefully, assessing him with the precision of someone who had seen far too many situations spiral into something more dangerous than they appeared. Monica folded her arms and leaned slightly forward, observing Marcus with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "You don't mind if we ask you a few questions, do you?" she said. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "It's protocol. A call came in and we just need to make sure everything checks out." Marcus nodded, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Of course. Ask whatever you need to," he said, still trying to mask the confusion that bubbled up inside him. "A call? What call?" Victoria Webb, still standing in her window across the street, peeked out and watched the scene unfold. She had dialed 911 moments earlier, still shaken by what she had witnessed. Her heart was racing, unsure of what exactly had led to the arrival of the police, but certain that she had done the right thing. Something had felt off when she saw Marcus messing with his router. The way he had been crouched on his porch, the furtive manner in which he had acted, it had set off alarm bells in her head. Monica looked toward Victoria's house, noting the woman standing by the window, her expression full of anxiety and anticipation. She could tell from the way Victoria watched them that she was likely the one who had made the call. Monica's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. Victoria seemed to be a nervous type. Her demeanor suggested she wasn't completely confident about the situation. It wasn't uncommon for people to call the police out of concern or even suspicion. But there was something more to this. Monica could feel it. "Tell us what happened exactly," Monica asked Marcus, turning her attention back to him. "You're saying you just changed the Wi-Fi password, but why would anyone call it in as suspicious activity?" Marcus felt a knot in his stomach, but he remained calm. "I noticed several devices connected to my network that weren't mine. It's a pretty common thing, right? Someone might get into your Wi-Fi if it's not secure. So I just decided to change the password." Jason nodded, jotting down some notes on his notepad. "Makes sense," he said. "But why would someone think you were tampering with something else? It doesn't add up, does it?" Marcus shook his head. "I have no idea. I don't know why anyone would call 911 about something so simple. I mean, it's just a Wi-Fi router. No one's breaking into my house or doing anything illegal." Monica took a step closer, her sharp eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. She had already noted his calm demeanor, the fact that he didn't seem alarmed by their presence. That was good, but there was something else she couldn't quite place. The whole situation felt off. "Just to clarify," she said, her voice still polite but edged with professionalism, "this is your router, right? You own the device and you're just changing the password for your own personal security." Marcus nodded, growing more frustrated with each passing second. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. It's just a password change. Nothing more." Victoria, now feeling an uneasy sense of guilt, turned away from the window and sat down at her kitchen table. She wrung her hands together, staring down at the cup of tea in front of her, barely noticing how cold it had become. What if she had misjudged Marcus? What if there was no real cause for concern? Had she overreacted? As Victoria sat there, doubt crept in, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had seen what she had seen. The strange way Marcus had been crouched outside his house, fiddling with his router in an almost suspicious manner. Perhaps her instincts had been right. Maybe she had just been the one to notice it first. But now, with the police involved, it was too late to turn back. Monica and Jason exchanged a glance. Both of them had noticed the tension in the air. They could tell that Marcus wasn't hiding anything. He seemed like a man who had nothing to hide, but the report was on file and they had a job to do. "All right, Marcus," Monica said finally, her voice softening just a little. "We'll need to take a look at the router if you don't mind. Just to make sure there's no tampering or anything that could indicate illegal activity." Marcus sighed but nodded. "I understand. Go ahead. I'm telling you, though, this is just a regular home network." Jason walked toward the router on the table, his eyes scanning the device. Monica took a step back, watching both Marcus and the device intently. The situation was slowly unraveling, revealing little threads of doubt, suspicion, and unease. But none of them seemed to lead anywhere concrete just yet. "All right," Jason said, inspecting the router carefully. "Everything looks in order here." Monica nodded, but the suspicion in her mind lingered. The situation didn't feel as simple as it seemed. Why had Victoria called? What exactly had she seen that triggered her reaction? There was more to this than just a simple Wi-Fi adjustment. As the officers prepared to leave, Monica exchanged a final look with Jason. They hadn't uncovered anything criminal, but the call had set something into motion. Someone had made a decision to escalate a situation that perhaps didn't need escalating. As the officers walked back to their squad car, Marcus stood there on his porch, still unsure of how things had gotten so out of hand. And across the street, Victoria Webb stood by her window once again, watching as the police car slowly drove away. The situation wasn't over yet. There were still questions to be answered, but one thing was certain: Oakridge would never be quite as peaceful as it once was. Detective Monica Hayes sat at her desk, her gaze fixed on the file in front of her. She'd spent the better part of the morning sifting through Marcus Grant's background, his resume, his freelance client list, even the subtle details of his personal life that had surfaced during the investigation. So far, everything checked out. Nothing in Marcus's past suggested any criminal tendencies. He was a graphic designer, working from home with no red flags to indicate suspicious activity. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of her neck. This case had started out so innocuously, just a simple 911 call about a Wi-Fi password reset. But now, after speaking with Marcus and reviewing his credentials, she had a sinking feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. "Everything's clean," Monica muttered to herself, her fingers idly tapping the folder in front of her. She looked over at Officer Jason Rivera, who was hunched over his computer, scrolling through phone records and other digital evidence. Monica had asked him to dig deeper, to check Marcus's phone and internet activity just to be sure there was no hidden agenda. It seemed overkill now, but better safe than sorry. Jason stopped his scrolling abruptly and sat up straight. "Monica, you might want to see this," he called, his voice tinged with a hint of surprise. Monica walked over to Jason's side, her curiosity piqued. He pointed at the screen where a list of IP addresses was displayed. "We've been checking the usage logs for Marcus's Wi-Fi, and guess what? There's a device that's been connected to his network for the past few weeks. Not just one time, but consistently. Someone has been using his internet without his permission." Monica's brow furrowed. "Okay, but who?" Jason zoomed in on the log file, highlighting the IP address associated with the unauthorized device. It's traced back to a device registered under the name Tyler Webb. He's listed as a family member of Victoria Webb, Marcus's neighbor. Monica blinked in surprise. "Victoria Webb's grandson?" "Yep," Jason confirmed. "Tyler Webb. He's been using Marcus's Wi-Fi every single day, and get this, when I cross-referenced his device usage with neighborhood security cameras, I found that he's been at Marcus's house several times. I think it's safe to say that he's been sneaking onto Marcus's property." Monica paused, trying to process the information. This was the kind of turn that made her head spin. Everything they'd initially thought about the situation was wrong. Victoria had been so sure that Marcus was the problem, but now it seemed her own flesh and blood was the one involved in something much more troubling. "Jason, can you pull up the rest of Tyler's activity? I want to know what else he's been up to," Monica ordered, her voice sharp with determination. She could feel the wheels of the investigation turning, each new detail revealing a darker truth. Jason quickly navigated to Tyler's phone records and internet activity logs, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He froze for a moment, eyes scanning the screen in disbelief. "Monica, you're not going to believe this." Monica's pulse quickened as she stepped closer, peering over his shoulder at the screen. "What is it?" Jason highlighted a list of web pages and accounts Tyler had accessed. His heart sank as he read the words. "This kid has been using Marcus's Wi-Fi to hack into other people's personal devices. And not just any devices, he's been accessing private data. Emails, bank accounts, social media, even other people's cameras." Monica took a step back, her mind racing. She had seen her fair share of investigations go sideways, but this was something she wasn't prepared for. It seemed so out of left field, and yet it made sense in a twisted way. Tyler Webb, the grandson of the nosy neighbor who had called in the 911 report on Marcus, had been the one all along tampering with the network. He was the one creating the disruption. He was the one who should have been under suspicion. "Get in touch with the local cybercrime unit," Monica instructed. "We need to know the full extent of what he's been doing. If he's been hacking people's private data and causing damage, we need to figure out how much of a mess this is before it spirals further." Jason nodded, already pulling up the contact information for the specialized unit. Monica couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration. How had they missed this? How had Victoria, who seemed so insistent on calling the police over something as trivial as a Wi-Fi change, not seen the signs in her own grandson's behavior? Had she been too blinded by her own suspicion to notice the real threat right under her nose? Hours later, Monica stood in the Webb family's living room, waiting for Victoria to arrive. She had already spoken with the cybercrime unit and discovered even more unsettling news. Tyler had been downloading sensitive personal information from his neighbors, including financial records, passwords, and private conversations. The extent of his activity was far worse than anything Marcus had been accused of. Monica looked down at the folder in her hands, the weight of the situation heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't just about Wi-Fi anymore. It was about betrayal, about a grandson who had taken advantage of the trust of not only his grandmother but the entire neighborhood. When Victoria finally walked through the door, she looked every bit the concerned grandmother Monica had expected, but there was something different in her eyes. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was denial. Either way, Monica could see that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "Detective Hayes," Victoria said, her voice wavering slightly as she stepped into the room. "What's all this about? Is everything okay with my grandson?" Monica stood up straighter, her expression cold but sympathetic. "We need to talk about Tyler, Victoria. What we've discovered goes much further than just a simple misunderstanding with Marcus Grant. Your grandson has been using his Wi-Fi network for weeks, and we've traced it back to a series of crimes he's committed. He's been hacking into people's personal devices, stealing private information and using it for his own gain." Victoria's face drained of color. She stumbled back a step, her hand clutching the edge of the coffee table for support. "What? No, that can't be true. My Tyler would never." Monica's gaze softened slightly, but she couldn't let the shock of the revelation cloud her professional judgment. "I'm afraid it's true, and it's worse than we initially thought. Tyler has been causing damage to people's lives, invading their privacy, stealing their information. It's a serious crime. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, her hands shaking. I don't know what to say. How could he do this? How could I not see it? Monica paused, waiting for Victoria to compose herself. The silence in the room was suffocating, filled only with the weight of Victoria's disbelief. Finally, Victoria's voice cracked as she whispered, I didn't want to believe it, but now, I don't know how to face him. How could I have let this happen under my roof? Monica didn't have an answer. She had seen this reaction countless times before, the shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming sense of guilt, but there was no turning back now. Tyler's actions had been exposed and the truth could no longer be hidden. As the conversation unfolded, the weight of the secrets grew heavier, leaving Victoria with a realization she would never forget. The truth had come to light, and it was far more complicated and damaging than she could have ever imagined. The sun had barely begun to set over Oak Ridge, Alabama, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban streets. The town, known for its peaceful charm and close-knit community, was now embroiled in a scandal that no one could have predicted. The investigation into Marcus Grant had become the talk of the neighborhood, a conversation that rippled through each block, sparking both curiosity and discomfort. As the news spread, the community's initial judgments about Marcus began to unravel. In the days following the discovery of Tyler Webb's hacking activities, residents who had once been quick to accuse Marcus of something sinister now found themselves questioning their assumptions. Some were ashamed, reflecting on how they had been quick to buy into Victoria Webb's story without considering the full picture. Others were still hesitant, reluctant to fully accept that they had misjudged someone who had only ever tried to mind his own business. Marcus, meanwhile, was no stranger to the whispers and sideways glances. He had lived in Oak Ridge for over 5 years, keeping mostly to himself. His days were filled with freelance graphic design work, his nights quiet and solitary. He had never sought attention, preferring the comfort of his own company to the typical suburban social scene. But after the incident with Victoria and the subsequent investigation, his life had been thrust into the spotlight in ways he never anticipated. It was at the local coffee shop where Marcus first encountered the shift in community sentiment. He walked in one afternoon to grab a coffee, hoping for a quiet moment to himself. As he stood in line, he overheard 2 women whispering nearby. "Did you hear? Marcus Grant's the one who got framed by that crazy neighbor. The whole thing was just ridiculous," one woman said, her voice a mix of sympathy and disbelief. The other nodded. "I've never been one to judge a book by its cover, but when that 911 call came in, I thought for sure he was up to something. Now I feel terrible about it. I've lived next to him for years and never even gave him a chance." Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't know how to feel about their words. On one hand, it was comforting to know that some people were realizing the mistake they had made. On the other, it hurt that the initial judgment had been so swift and harsh. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing how quickly people were willing to condemn someone based on suspicion alone. Victoria Webb's guilt weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had spent the past few days wrestling with her own shame and embarrassment, replaying her actions over and over in her mind. The phone call to 911, her hastily made assumptions, her accusatory tone, none of it sat well with her anymore. She had acted out of fear and ignorance, never once considering the possibility that she was wrong. It wasn't just the neighborhood's judgment that haunted her, it was the pain she had caused Marcus. She had always prided herself on being a good neighbor, someone who looked out for everyone around her. But in her haste to make sense of a situation she didn't fully understand, she had hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. In an attempt to make amends, Victoria decided to visit Marcus's home. She didn't know what to say or how to say it, but she knew that she couldn't let this go without at least trying to apologize. She knocked on his door one afternoon, her hands trembling as she stood on the porch. When Marcus answered, he looked surprised to see her. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Marcus," she began, her voice soft and hesitant. I owe you an apology. I made a mistake. I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realize now that I judged you without cause. You didn't deserve that. I'm so sorry." Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to take responsibility for the way he had been treated, let alone the person who had been the catalyst for it all. The wound was still fresh, and it was hard for him to simply let go of the way he had been treated. "I appreciate the apology, Victoria," he said slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "But you can't just undo what happened. It's not just about the Wi-Fi. It's about how quick people were to assume the worst about me, to label me based on my appearance and the assumptions they made." Victoria's face softened with regret. She had known that Marcus's words were true, but hearing them directly from him made her realize just how deep the issue ran. "I understand. And I'm sorry for being part of that." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of car tires on the gravel driveway interrupted them. Detective Monica Hayes had arrived to meet with Marcus and take a step further in addressing the impact of the situation. She had been in contact with the local community center about hosting a forum on racial profiling, and she wanted to extend the opportunity to the residents of Oak Ridge to discuss their assumptions and biases in a safe space. The conversation shifted from personal apologies to a broader discussion on community attitudes. As Marcus and Victoria stood side by side on the porch, Monica addressed the gathering crowd, her voice carrying a sense of purpose. "Good afternoon, everyone," Monica began. "I've called this meeting because we need to have a conversation about assumptions, about biases, and about the way we treat one another in this community. What happened here with Marcus Grant is not isolated. It happens every day, all across the country, and it starts with small, seemingly harmless judgments. But those judgments can snowball into something much more damaging." She paused to let the words settle before continuing. "The problem isn't just about race. It's about how we let fear and suspicion cloud our better judgment. It's about how we judge people by the way they look, by their skin color, by their appearance, without taking the time to really understand who they are." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Monica had been a part of many community discussions before, but there was something different about this one. Perhaps it was the rawness of the situation, the way the community had been forced to confront its own biases in real time. It was uncomfortable, yes, but that discomfort was necessary if any change was to take place. As the evening wore on, the group began to open up. People shared their own experiences with racial profiling, with assumptions they had made about others, and the consequences of those assumptions. Victoria, still shaken by the revelation about her grandson, spoke up as well, her voice trembling as she confessed her own mistakes. "I never thought about the harm I was causing when I called 911 on Marcus," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I thought I was just being a good neighbor, but now I see that I was part of a bigger problem. I didn't even consider the possibility that I was wrong." The discussion grew deeper, and people began to realize the extent of their own biases. Some were uncomfortable, but it was clear that the community was ready to have this conversation. Monica guided them through it, offering her perspective as a police officer who had seen firsthand how deeply embedded these issues were in society. By the time the meeting drew to a close, there was a shift in the air. Oak Ridge wasn't suddenly a perfect, bias-free community, but the seeds of change had been planted. The residents had taken the first step in acknowledging their assumptions, and they were ready to begin the process of understanding one another in a more genuine and compassionate way. Marcus stood off to the side, quietly watching the transformation unfolding before him. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully recover from the way he had been treated, but seeing the community come together in this way gave him a sense of hope. It was a start, at least, and sometimes that was all you needed. The weeks that followed the resolution of Marcus Grant's ordeal were quiet, but they were far from uneventful. Oak Ridge, Alabama, a town known for its sleepy streets and suburban charm, was slowly becoming a place of reflection and change. The dust had settled from the scandal that had shaken the neighborhood, but its impact lingered, leaving behind a trail of new understandings, hard conversations, and for some, growth. Marcus, now more attuned to the undercurrents of racial tension and prejudice, found himself reflecting deeply on everything that had transpired. He spent his days working from home, still focused on his freelance graphic design career, but his mind often wandered back to the night that had altered his life. The evening when he had been accused by his neighbor, Victoria Webb, and questioned by the police. The incident had shaken him to the core, forcing him to face just how easily his life could have been turned upside down by something as simple as a wrong assumption. As he sat in his living room one morning, his laptop open in front of him, Marcus thought about what it meant to live in a place where, for the most part, everyone knew each other but didn't always truly know one another. How quickly fear and ignorance could fuel suspicion, and how little it took for someone's life to be scrutinized under a microscope. But even as those thoughts swirled in his mind, Marcus found solace in the growing sense of awareness that seemed to be taking root in Oak Ridge. It was clear that the investigation into his life had opened more than just the truth about his Wi-Fi. It had opened a conversation about racial profiling, privacy, and the dangers of assumptions. And while Marcus wasn't naive enough to think that things would immediately change in a small southern town, he couldn't ignore the signs of hope that had emerged in the aftermath of the events. Victoria Webb had spent the last few weeks grappling with guilt and shame. The consequences of her actions had been far-reaching, and she knew it. She had allowed her suspicions and her fears to cloud her judgment, leading to a mistake that had nearly destroyed a man's reputation and peace of mind. She was no stranger to the weight of regret, but this situation felt different. The call to 911, the accusations against Marcus, had all been made without thought for the repercussions, without considering that the man she was accusing was just another neighbor trying to live his life. Now, in the wake of the truth being revealed, Victoria was determined to make things right. Her pride had been bruised, but more than that, she understood now the implications of her prejudiced assumptions. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to make amends, and that was something she needed to do. One afternoon, Victoria found herself standing on Marcus's doorstep again, this time without the tension of a false accusation hanging over her. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but the words still felt heavy in her mouth as she knocked on the door. When Marcus answered, she saw the wariness in his eyes, a wariness she didn't blame him for. He had every right to be cautious, to be reluctant to let her into his space after everything that had happened. But despite the distance between them, Victoria stood her ground. I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was wrong, so wrong. I've spent so much time thinking about everything that happened, and I see now how easily I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I was scared and didn't know what else to do, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I accused you without any evidence and I caused you harm. I'm truly sorry, Marcus. I hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that was evident in her posture. It was clear that she understood the gravity of her actions now. But even as he processed her apology, a part of him still carried the weight of the past few weeks, the stress, the confusion, the hurt. "I appreciate you coming here, Victoria," Marcus said after a pause, his voice calm but firm. "And I do accept your apology, but it's going to take time for me to fully move past this. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to forget how quickly you and others made assumptions about me." "That's something that's not so easy to brush off." Victoria nodded, understanding that the damage had already been done. "I know," she replied softly, "and I don't expect you to forget. I just want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, to being better." As the days passed, the conversations in Oakridge continued to evolve. More and more residents began to reflect on what had happened and what they had learned from it. Detective Monica Hayes and Officer Jason Rivera, who had been involved in the investigation from the start, had also taken time to reflect on their roles in the situation. They had seen firsthand how easily a simple misunderstanding could escalate into something much larger, and they both knew that the experience had changed them. Monica, who had been on the front lines of law enforcement for many years, understood the complexities of her profession better than most. She had been involved in enough investigations to know how quickly things could go wrong when assumptions were made. But Marcus's case had illuminated just how insidious racial profiling could be. It wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about how society at large viewed people based on their skin color or their appearance. One evening, as she sat with Officer Rivera at a local diner, Monica spoke openly about the lessons she had learned from the investigation. "We have to do better," Monica said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I'm glad Marcus is okay, but this whole situation really opened my eyes. We need to approach these situations with more care, more sensitivity. We can't let assumptions guide us. We can't let fear determine our actions." Officer Rivera nodded in agreement. "You're right. I've seen it too many times, the way people react to someone who doesn't look like they belong. This case was an eye-opener. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to check our biases, no matter how subtle they may be." Monica sighed, her gaze focused on the horizon outside. "I hope Oakridge can use this as a starting point. I hope that the conversations we're having now about race, assumptions, and empathy can lead to real change." The final days of the investigation were quieter, but Oakridge was undeniably different. It was no longer just a town where everyone kept to themselves. It was a community beginning to grapple with its flaws and embrace the opportunity for growth. Marcus, too, felt the shift in the air. He was no longer the man who had been wrongly accused. He was the man who had survived the ordeal and was ready to move forward. He still had his reservations, of course. Racial profiling was not a problem that could be solved overnight, and Marcus knew that. But as he walked down the streets of Oakridge, he noticed a change in how people looked at him. There was a new understanding in the air, a new sense of openness. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And as he looked toward the future, Marcus felt cautiously optimistic. He had survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. Oakridge was learning, evolving, and it was ready for a fresh start, just like him.